Changeling Space Program. By Chris Overstreet. Interlude. ESA Flight 6. Flames rushed around the nose cone of the rapidly descending rocket ship, filling the solitary porthole with red and orange light. Gravity hauled down hard on the pilot's body, pulling hard enough to make the straps holding her to the acceleration couch creak alarmingly. Loud klaxons filled the capsule interior with noise, almost enough to drown out the chaotic shouting in her ears. Pull up, dash, pull up. Fire your rockets, dash, maybe you can steer. No. Dash is going too fast already, any more speed and 30,000 and falling. Speed over 1,000 meters per second. That's faster than anything on the way up. The pilot managed to make herself heard. Controls not responding. The stick's dead. I repeat, I have no control over the craft. 25,000 and falling. The ship gave a little lurch. Rainbow Dash, your main parachute's just blown up. Computer estimates 30 seconds to impact. Twilight, can't you teleport her out of there? I wish I could, but she's too far away and moving too fast and there's not room in the capsule for both. 20,000 and falling. Heat warnings on radial parachutes 1, 3, 2, and 4. The pilot wanted the voices to stop. They were all her friends, and they were all frightened and panicking, and she wanted to make it stop and she couldn't. She couldn't even talk anymore, the forces on the ship pulled her so hard against the straps that they were digging in even through her pressure suit. She could barely breathe, and a blackness at the edge of her vision she normally only noticed when maneuvering at rainboom speeds was creeping forward bit by bit. And despite all this, she had enough presence of mind to think. Relighting the engine is no-go. I can't slow myself down like that, and speed is what's going to kill me, not angle of descent. It's too late to flip the ship over anyway. Air gets a lot thicker from 15,000 feet on down, and I'll slow down in a hurry. I might slow down enough to break out of the slipstream and pull the nose up to slow down more. Once I get below 300 meters per second I can fire the remaining parachutes, all 10 of them, and if they don't work I'm dead anyway. If I were flying by myself I could survive a direct impact of 400 meters per second. I've done it before. The Mach cone of my sonic rainboom provides a good shock absorber, thank you Pegasus magic. But it's too late to bail out now. So, keep pulling the nose up, keep the hoof on the parachute release, and don't black out. That's all I can do. Peak speed 1222 meters per second. Now below 800 meters per second. Altitude 10,000 and falling. 15 seconds to impact. Dash, you have to hit the parachutes at 1,000 meters, even if they red light. Can you hear me? 700 meters at 6,000 altitude. 10 seconds. Dashy, please say something. 500 meters at 4,000 altitude. Rainbow Dash. Rainbow Dash. Dash, wake up. Rainbow Dash blinked, shook her head, and took a deep, shuddering breath. She was in the capsule of a rocket, but not that capsule, not that rocket, and not about to plow into the Griffin Sea. That had been weeks ago, and about 2/3 of all the nights since. Baltimore, this is 6, she said. Receiving you. What's up? 6, we want you to try out some of the in-flight rations and record a report about eating in space, the voice of Applejack drawled through the headphones of Dash's flight suit. Once that's done, we want you to suit back up in preparation for the main mission task. All right. Suits me fine, Baltimore, Rainbow Dash replied. What's to eat? Dunno, Applejack replied. Pinky made all the rations, but she's not here. Yeah, I know. Sighing, Rainbow Dash unbuckled herself from the flight seat, swung the back down, and opened one of the storage compartments for a dehydrated meal. Earlier she'd tested the brand new bathroom modifications to the otherwise standard Cherry's rocket parts capsule she was in, and reported her less than satisfaction. Among other things, the lingering smell was unappetizing. Rainbow Dash found the dehydrated food supplies and drew out a foil packet with an extra wrapper taped to the side. The stick-on label said, in Pinky's hoof writing, alfalfa curry with rice and chocolate chow patty with icing. And in smaller print, sorry it's not a cupcake, but Twilight says no crumbs in the spacecraft. PP. Whatever. Dash unwrapped the flatbread, which wasn't dehydrated, used the attached tube to add icing, trickier than expected in free fall, but doable, and ate it first. She then attached the entree packet to the magic water spigot and let the teleport hot water do its thing while she thought about how crazy things had been since the last time she'd been in a rocket. Equestria Space Agency's Flight 5 had ended with Dash triggering the remaining parachutes on the ship 3 seconds before she would have hit the ocean at just under the speed of sound. The sudden deceleration knocked her unconscious instantly, and she'd spent the following week in the hospital recovering from a fractured collarbone and 2 cracked ribs. Fortunately Pegasi healed fast, allowing her to get back to her busy schedule of training with the Wonderbolts, saving Equestria from monsters and unfriendly ponies, and oh yeah, her sideline as courageous rocket jock pony. Except it hadn't been as easy for the others as it had been for Rainbow Dash. All she had to deal with was the nightmares. Princess Luna prevented them from going beyond replays of memory, and she had offered to get rid of them completely, but Rainbow Dash wanted the reminder of just how serious this rocket pilot thing really was. The other ponies, on the other hand, had all had it much, much worse. She and the girls had never been able to devote their full attention to the space program. Fluttershy had her animals, and Pinkie Pie had work and party planning, and neither one liked the horrible scare Flight 5 had put into them. They were out, done, period, end of discussion. Applejack and Rarity were still willing to help, but both had business responsibilities heavier than Fluttershy and Pinkie Pie. With fall coming on, the harvest at Sweet Apple Acres and the fall fashion season pulled both of them away for days at a time. All 4 of those ponies walked around in a state of depression, feeling guilty at not being there for Rainbow Dash and Twilight Sparkle, feeling afraid that the next close call would be more than a close call, feeling distracted and upset and, as Pinkie put it, anti-smile. And Twilight Sparkle. Well, let's be honest, the egghead had cracked. The evening of the flight, and the day after, she'd been just functional enough to explain to the press that setbacks were only setbacks and that getting the pilot back alive was the important thing. And then, once the reporters had all gone home, she'd returned to Ponyville, gone to her bedroom in the Crystal Castle, and quietly folded in on herself for a week and a half. Starlight, Glimmer and Spike managed to drag her out of bed every day to come to the hospital to visit Rainbow Dash, and Dash, being glad of the company, hadn't noticed just how much of a basket case her friend was at the time or how short the visits were. After she'd been cleared for release and limited Wonderbolts workouts, Dash had spent a few days catching up on her non-Astromare life, cleaning her home, helping Tank choose a spot for his coming hibernation, and of course giving interviews and fan appearances, because hey, you didn't let your supporters down, right? On the 16th day after Flight 5 she visited Twilight Sparkle, and saw just how bad things were. Rainbow Dash, being the take-charge mare she knew she was, dragged Twilight out of her book fort and into her lab, stuck her in front of a chalkboard, and told her to get back to work being a rocket scientist. That was the thing, if you crash, get back up and do it again. You didn't let the fear rule you. You faced down the fear. And she understood exactly what the fear was. Dash hadn't really been afraid during the almost crash, she'd been too busy and distracted to be afraid, but when she woke in the hospital she'd been horrified to realize just how close she'd come. Hence the flashback nightmares, which thank Faust hadn't happened while she was awake. But she'd come that close to meeting her maker several times before. And she'd always got back up and tried it again, and again, until she got it right. Until she got over the fear. Of course, in order to get over this particular fear, Rainbow Dash needed a new rocket, which meant getting her genius buddy out of her nervous breakdown. This had taken much of another 2 weeks, during which time the whole thing with Flim and Flam had cropped up. Twilight had overreacted, and Celestia had tried to step in to fix everything, and gradually Twilight had pulled herself together by using outrage at the television scam to overcome fear of failure and fear of loss of a friend. Dash, Spike, and Starlight Glimmer had worked out a routine. The day's news about Flim and Flam's attempts to regain their television patent was kept from Twilight until she showed signs of funk during a space-related discussion. Then assistant or student would bring in the news, Twilight would get angry, and after a few minutes she would be centered and on top of things again. Fluttershy said this wasn't healthy, but Dash didn't care. All she cared about was, it worked. The more Twilight was functional, the more functional she became. By the time the Flim Flams aired their newsreel about CSP Mission 9, Twilight Sparkle was out of her anxiety paralysis, kicking flank and taking names, or maybe kicking chalk and taking numbers, or however geeks do it. But in the meantime, with Twilight still shell-shocked and the other girls unmotivated, Rainbow Dash became the driving force of the equestrian space effort. Her top priority, going through every single aspect of Flight 5 and finding absolutely everything that went wrong. She began the investigation with the obvious point, pilot error. She'd nosed over too far trying to get a horizontal trajectory and, instead, had kept herself too low. On the other hand, according to Twilight, that had ended up being a good thing in a way. Dash had shut down the engine with 10% fuel remaining when the first heat warnings and plasma streamers appeared during ascent. If she'd burned all the fuel, she'd probably have still been supersonic when the ship reached the ocean, and the parachutes would have failed. Of course she should have flipped the ship immediately, 35 miles above the ground, instead of hanging on too long hoping for a second burn. That was inexcusable, but it revealed another problem. There was no pony in any position to make the final call on the ground. ESA's informal buddy system had all the flaws of rule by consensus, and during a flight you needed clear, rapid decision-making, something consensus usually didn't do. Some pony had to be in charge, and it was obvious that Twilight Sparkle was going to be that pony, what with the Alicorn Princess thing, the element of magic thing, and oh yes, the smarter than every pony else combined thing. Rainbow Dash was fine with that. She still had confidence in herself, but each nighttime repeat of the flight was a reminder that she needed some pony to put on the brakes when she went too far. For that job she trusted no pony more than Twilight Sparkle. This led into another point: calm discipline. Rainbow Dash, with extreme reluctance, had asked the Changelings for a recording of CSP Mission 6's comms from the capsule point of view. She'd then played the recording against a recording of ESA Flight 5 for the others. The differences couldn't be plainer. The ESA recording was confused, distracting, worse than useless. The CSP recording, though it had its fear, was simple, to the point, clear, and above all calm. Rainbow Dash then asked which recording they'd rather be stuck in a closet listening to while trying to thread an electrically charged needle. No pony answered. The point was made, and ESA adopted CSP's flight communications protocols for all future flights. Other ideas got kicked around. Dash's explanation of the dire and pressing need for the pressure suits to be redesigned for removal and redonning in flight and to cope with bathroom accidents during launch and descent left the other ponies blushing, laughing, or both. Starlight Glimmer proposed various methods of in-flight rescue and retrieval of pilots in case of disaster, and that got discussed for most of an afternoon. Finally Twilight Sparkle brought up the thing that had caused her mental collapse: rocket design. Flight 5's configuration had been her idea, her attempt to show that she was smarter than Queen Chrysalis. The flight attempted to be a single stage to space, 100% retrievable rocket, and that extra weight had dragged the rocket down faster than it went up, with almost disastrous consequences. Flight 5 had proved beyond all doubt that, if such a thing was ever going to work, the technology wasn't there yet. It took days to get Twilight to work past blaming herself for the mission failure and to focus on planning the next mission. And the next mission, at this point, was obvious: orbit. Cherry Berry, flying for Chrysalis and her brood, had come within a donkey's spit of making orbit. The next time she or Chrysalis went up, they'd fix that shortcoming. Of course, the next time Eniponi et al. Used anything similar to the Mission 9 rocket design, they would make orbit if they wanted to. That, Applejack had argued, could be them, if they were quick about it. Rainbow Dash had vetoed that. Copying Mission 9 would be just that, copying, following, like a little sister mimicking a big sister. Every pony knew Cherry Berry should have had the honor of first in orbit except for her mission requirements holding her back. The ESA would get no credit for first orbit if they did it the CSP way, but they would get a lot of disrespect for being copycats. Of course, whatever rocket they used would end up being very close to CSP Mission 9 anyway. They didn't have time to make a new design. The Equestrian Space Agency was, by unavoidable necessity, a part-time thing. Twilight Sparkle and her friends remained Equestria's last line of defense against monster attack and its first line of defense against friendship problems. Each of them, even Spike, had things in their life that needed doing that had nothing to do with spaceflight. Everything they'd accomplished had been done, to be blunt, in their spare time. Otherwise, Dash knew for a fact, they'd have left the changelings in their dust. And by mid-fall the ESA would basically shut down for the winter. There was too much for each of them to do back home. Nightmare Night, the running of the leaves and winter ramp up, the last harvests, and all sorts of community responsibilities were calling them back to Ponyville. Time was short for getting any new mission off the ground before the end of the year, and they couldn't spare any time to make an orbit-capable ship that wasn't basically CSP-9 with the Royal Sisters flag painted on the side. So, said Dash at the planning meeting, since they were stuck using the Changeling's rocket design, they needed something else they could do once they got into orbit to prove they had jumped ahead in the space race, something no pony else could do without ESA's help. Also, said Twilight, the ESA program needed time to integrate new safety measures. They also needed a new backup pilot, since Fluttershy, who'd never been interested in actually flying, was all the way out now. Spitfire and AK Yearling, both listed as reserve backup pilots, were too busy in their normal lives to put in the training a backup pilot needed. And, finally, Twilight insisted there would be no flights until they had some way, anyway, of rescuing a pilot in flight, or stranded in orbit, or whatever. That was when Starlight Glimmer had the idea. And now, 2 days after Cherry Berry had achieved precisely one lap of the planet, and several hours into a much longer flight than the changelings had dared, that idea was about to be put into action. Rainbow Dash made some offhand comments about the food, spicy but good, a bit mushy though, and who cares about crumbs, disposed of the wrappers, and worked her way back into the new design pressure suit. Rarity's redesign was much easier to get into and out of than the original, but the bathroom arrangements while it was on were, as Rarity herself admitted, undignified. Dash had a better word, gross. The new design had an extra feature, a totally redesigned backpack, with the life support systems miniaturized to make room for the thing that would put the ESA firmly in the lead in the race to the moon. Bolty Mare, this is 6, Rainbow Dash said, twisting her helmet into place. Suit on, performing pressure checks now. Bolty Mare copies, Applejack said. You are go for Eva at your discretion. Roger that, Bolty Mare, Rainbow Dash replied. The HUD projected on the inside of her helmet, including a tiny duplicate of the magic NAV ball used for steering the rocket, reported green lights on suit pressure. No air lost, all systems go. Technically she could survive for days in the suit, thanks to the water supply available from a straw at her cheek, so long as she could stand the smell and feel of her own poop. Not that Dash intended to make that endurance test if she had any choice at all. Besides, the pressure suit bound her wings to her sides, and a Pegasus who can't move her wings is a supremely uncomfortable Pegasus. Now that she could get into and out of the pressure suit as she pleased, she intended to stay out of it whenever she could get away with it. Unfortunately, she thought as she hit the switch to reverse the magical air supply and empty the cabin of air, this isn't one of those times. Bolty Mare, this is 6. Go ahead, 6. Cabin pressure is at 0. I'm going out for a walk. I may be a little while. Copy, 6. There was, in case of dire emergency, a single lever which could be used to permanently and thoroughly open the hatch. If you wanted to close the hatch again afterwards, you had to use a separate, rather complicated system. At first Rainbow Dash had hated it, but she'd come to understand the logic. This door was not one you wanted to take any chance whatever of just coming open by itself. The tricky bit was getting the hatch closed behind her without falling off. There were 4 hoof rails on the exterior of the capsule, 2 rungs below the hatch and 1 on either side of it. Aside from those, there wasn't any place to hold onto the ship, and those 4 rails were none too large, especially when you had to hold on with hooves wrapped in a pressure suit. To make things even better, the physics of free fall meant that Rainbow Dash's body and limbs wanted to keep going in whatever direction she'd moved them last, taking the rest of her with them. To her it felt a bit like the rocket was actively trying to shake her off, even though the engine was shut down and nothing was moving but herself. Eventually she got the hatch closed, got a grip on the capsule exterior with all 4 limbs, and waited until her body was motionless in relation to the ship. Only then did she say, "Bolty mare, I'm outside the capsule now, ready to step off the welcome mat." Copy, 6, Applejack replied. "You're go to release the craft in your own time." Now came the one truly scary part, the one thing Twilight Sparkle and Starlight Glimmer hadn't been able to think their way around. Experiments with a backup tether had ended with first Rainbow Dash and then Princess Cadance, the new backup pilot after the official merger of ESA and the Crystal Empire space program, tangled in a cat's cradle in the training bay. If the thrusters on the new, redesigned spacesuit backpack failed to activate, or if they misfired in any way, Dash would probably have to hope that, someday, somehow, she and the capsule drifted close enough together again to grab it. Rainbow Dash released one foreleg from its grip and turned to look back at the world below her. She was over the ocean, of course. A horrible little voice in the back of her mind said, "How'd you like to plummet into that in a ball of fire, this time without a rocket or parachutes? No. You work through the fear. You don't let it control you." Rainbow Dash straightened her body, made sure it was still, and then slowly, carefully, released her grip on the capsule. Her body drifted very, very slowly away. She could still reach with her hooves for a hold if she absolutely needed to, but in about 10 seconds that wouldn't be true anymore. "Activating thruster pack," Rainbow Dash said. This required moving her elbows into a certain position and holding it for a full second, which commanded the backpack to extend 2 controls on long arm rests. The stick under her left hoof would provide lateral, forward and backward thrust, the one under her right hoof would control thrust up and down and left and right yaw. Each of the thrusters gave a quick burst of test fire, then a couple more bursts to bring her back stationary in relationship with the capsule. "Thruster check all green," Rainbow Dash reported. "I'm going to back away from the ship now." She pulled back slightly on the left joystick, and thrusters pushed her away from the craft. She released her pressure, and the thrusters cut off. She nudged forward for a moment, and the capsule almost, but not quite, stopped falling away from her. "Hey, this is pretty neat," she said. "It's almost like really flying." 6, Bolty mare, Applejack said calmly. "We're watching you down here on the big screen, and it all looks good. Twilight wants you to move 100 meters away from the craft, stop, and then return to the hatch. Why got that?" "Affirmative, Bolty mare," Rainbow Dash said. "Copy 100 meters away and return to hatch." She looked at the ship. She was already about 10 meters out and drifting very slowly further, but that drift was towards the planet. She wasn't happy with that direction. Instead she kicked the left joystick to her right and held it for a bit, flying sideways down the stubby length of the orbiter and past the final stage engine. Satisfied, she released the thruster and let momentum do the work for about a minute or so. "Okay, 6, that's good," Applejack finally said. "Now get on back." Rainbow Dash pushed the left joystick to the left for what she guessed was about as long as she'd held it right, cancelling out her momentum. Unfortunately her helmet's peripheral vision, limited as it was, wouldn't let her see the rocket anymore. She used the right stick to roll left, then nulled the roll as her heads-up display added a little pink square around the orbiter, which was farther away than she'd expected. No big, she thought. I've still got massive amounts of charge in the mono battery. Facing the orbiter, she thrust forward for a bit, holding the thrust quite a bit longer for the return trip. A bit too long, as it happened. 6, we're showing you at 5 meters per second relative velocity, Applejack said, her drawl speeding up with urgency. Please slow down a bit. Dash's hoof was already on the control and counter-thrusting, but not soon enough. Fortunately, or not depending on your point of view, she hadn't been precisely aimed at the orbiter. Very close, but not precisely. Still going more than a meter per second in relation to the spaceship, Rainbow Dash's left rear hoof clipped the edge of the fuel tank, sending her spinning plot over tea kettle. The thruster systems, sensing the release of the controls and the motion of the pilot's arms, retracted and shut down, allowing her to tumble and spin freely. Ho-ho-oh. Not cool. Rainbow Dash. Twilight Sparkle's voice shouted over the comm link. Are you all right? Suit integrity and systems check. Wah. Who? Rainbow Dash pulled her mind from the universe tumbling around her and focused on the little lights in the heads-up display. Twilight, we talked about comm discipline, remember? Let Applejack do the suit systems check. Rainbow Dash reached a hoof up to rub her ringing ears, then groaned when it bumped the side of her helmet. Right, she said. All readouts show green, air pressure good. No leaks, nothing broken, not even my hoof. She returned her focus to the outside world and added, I'm in one heck of a tumble, though, and I've lost sight of the ship. Gimme a minute to fix that. A moment later she had the thrusters activated again, and their automatic startup routine quickly stopped her tumble and stabilized her. She was still drifting, but at least now she had an orientation. Okay, roll stopped, she said. Attempting to reacquire spaceship. Use the targeting function, Twilight said. Your suit has a new map display. Activate it and it should show the ship. Just like in training. You mean, the same training where we practiced comm discipline, Baltimore? Dash replied. Will you, ugh. Yes, 6, that training. Rainbow Dash smiled inside her spacesuit. Angry Twilight was much better than worried freak-out Twilight or depressed guilt-tripping Twilight. Angry Twilight could get things done, and Twilight seldom stayed angry for long. Using the HUD controls required deactivating the thrusters for a moment, but so long as she didn't thrash around she would remain stable. She reached to her chest, opened the lid of the control box, and activated the map HUD, selected the icon for the orbiter, and set it as her target. A pink ring appeared on the NAV ball, towards the left lower edge of the visible half. As Rainbow Dash reactivated the thrusters and reoriented herself, the pink ring moved gradually to the center of the ball, overlaying a retrograde marker. The velocity readout, instead of showing orbital speed, now showed a velocity of 0.9 meters per second relative to target. Rainbow Dash's smile vanished as she looked at the ship. Baltimore, can you see the ship now? She said. When I clipped the ship going past I set it to tumbling slowly. Getting in is going to be a pain. The tumble wasn't very fast, but it didn't need to be. Now she'd have to grab onto a moving object and hold on long enough to get the hatch open. A tricky proposition when your species doesn't have any digits at all on their limbs, doubly so when those limbs are wrapped in a heavily padded, pressurized suit. We see it, Twilight said, belatedly adding, 6. Deep breath. We're going to have to be careful about keeping relative speed slow when near the spacecraft. For now, though, don't worry about anything else except getting back into the ship. 6 copies, Baltimore, Rainbow Dash said. She reactivated the thrusters, moving forward gingerly, reversing thrust as she approached the ship. She found herself drifting left, counter-thrusted, and discovered herself rushing right 3 times as fast. She counter-thrusted yet again, but couldn't get the drift precisely stopped. Thrust, counter-thrust, counter-counter-thrust, and still drifting. And now, drifting down as well. She thrusted up, then right again, then left, then right, then down. None of the maneuvers added up to holding still. Baltimore, 6, Rainbow Dash growls, this is just stupid. I can't null out my drift. These controls aren't precise enough. She found herself getting too close to the wrong side of the ship as it slowly tumbled, and she thrust away, backing off. This caused a strong drift left, and she overcorrected right, sending her in front of the ship and up. 2 more overcorrections later she was moving away from the ship at close to a meter per second. Use the navball. Twilight insisted. Prograde and retrograde markers. Start by matching velocity with the ship, then keep centered on the target until you get close. Just like training. In training, Rainbow Dash had the orientation of the training bay with its complicated cables and counterweights. Things were well lit, plenty of landmarks, distances easy to judge by eye. She'd barely paid any attention to the navball. Up here in space, even in the sunlight, everything was shaded dark as night, literally on the side away from the sun. Things reflected oddly. There was nothing up here except herself and the ship. The skills she used by instinct were nearly useless up here. Learn fast, Crash, she thought to herself. A lot of little fillies are going to be disappointed if the next Wonderbolts show has to fly missing mare formation. It took a minute of careful work to bring her relative velocity back to 0, some 70 meters from the ship. This time she watched the navball more than she did the ship, thrusting this way and that even when it made little sense, moving the prograde circle T into the center of the pink ring. She moved forwards at a leisurely 0.3 of a meter relative speed, cautious and patient. Easy, she told herself. Still plenty of juice for the thrusters. All the time in the world. Take it easy, think it through, do it right. By and by the ship drew closer. She brought her velocity back to 0 some 10 meters ahead of the center of mass, just far enough to be well clear of the tumbling ship. Okay, she thought, solutions? I could let the nose of the ship bump me. Inertia should stop its tumble, and I could use the thrusters to recover. No. I got lucky once. Rainbow Dash is pretty hard to break, but the suit is another thing. And if it breaks, no more Rainbow Dash. No playing bumper cars with the spacesuit. But maybe I could get next to the ship near the center, gradually slide up, and use my thrusters to push the ship until it stopped tumbling? No. I'd have to push the ship with my body. I can't rely on my rear hooves perfectly lining up with thrust, and if I push with all hooves the thrusters automatically shut down. That's bumper cars again. Think of something else. When I got out, the hatch was pointed at Equus. It was facing sideways, not on top or bottom. If I get on that side of the ship, I should be able to see it clearly, and I might be able to grab the rungs as they pass by on a tumble. That's a plan. I'm moving around to the side of the ship, Dash said. I'm going to get as close as I can, zero out relative to the ship, and make a grab for the hatch egress rungs. Baltimore copies, 6, Twilight Sparkle said. Please be careful. Trust me, Rainbow Dash said, letting a bit of the old brag into her voice. I'd never leave you hanging. Yet, she added to herself, but what about leaving myself hanging? With careful, light taps of the controls, Rainbow Dash slid around the port side of the tumbling rocket, used the thrusters to pivot so that she faced that side, and then very, very carefully bounced back and forth on horizontal and vertical thrust until she had only a slight drift left and down. This done, she gave the slightest goose of the thrusters forward, drifting towards the ship's fuel tank. As she approached, the tank was replaced by empty space, and then by the capsule. And, praise be to Celestia, the blessed rungs. Rainbow Dash released the thruster controls, reached forward, missed the rung on the left side of the hatch as it passed, hooked her left forehoof under the right rung, wrapped her right forehoof around it and held on for dear life. For a couple of moments everything, absolutely everything, seemed to spin. Then one of Dash's flailing rear hooves found one of the steps. She shoved the hoof in as deep as she could, braced herself, and swiftly stretched her left forehoof across the hatch to grab the other rung. I caught it. A loud sigh of relief echoed through Dash's headset. Good work, Rainbow Dash, she said. Re-enter the ship in your own time. Don't take any risks. Once you're inside, the rest of the day is free time, and we'll begin re-entry at 1000 hours tomorrow morning Baltimore time. Really? Rainbow Dash asked. So if my time is mine, does that mean I can do another EVA later? This was kind of fun, but I need more practice to get it right. A moment later something made a loud popping sound in Rainbow Dash's ears. Ow! Baltimore, this is Mission 6, comms check. After a few moments Applejack's voice replied, 6, I think we'd all appreciate it if you just stayed in the capsule for the rest of the flight. And when Twilight comes to, I'm sure she'll agree. What? It's not nice to give ponies a scare like that, you know, Applejack added. Especially when they've been high-strung for a really long time. AJ, what happened? Our fearless flight director's eyes just sorta rolled up into her head. Round about time you said words, more practice, Applejack continued. She's out cold on the floor right now. Spike's gone to get some water to bring her round. Oh. Sorry, Rainbow Dash chuckled nervously. My bad. I'll just get back in the capsule now, okay? Y'all do that, Applejack said. The process of opening the capsule hatch from the outside in space was almost as complicated as the process of opening it from within. With the need to hold on with 3 limbs while the ship tumbled, it became even more complicated. But Rainbow Dash now had a little extra motivation. Twilight, after all. Oh, yeah, and getting down alive from orbit, but that was tomorrow. Right now friends were more important. Author's note. When I first got Kerbal Space Program, there was no tutorial at all for spacewalking, and the docking tutorial was, less than useful. One of the good things the 1.1 update did was improve both tremendously. The first time I played career mode in KSP, I ground to a halt because I lost a spacewalker I was trying to rescue. I set the game aside for a couple months, then came back to it and looked elsewhere for hints on how to do it. I'm probably the only KSP player whose gameplay improved thanks to tips from Ron and Pawn. The original intent of the designers was that the spacesuits would have a limited supply of fuel, which they do, which could be refilled from a limited supply of RCS monopropellant fuel. In the earliest testing they decided, out of frustration no doubt, that it would be better for gameplay purposes to just give the Kerbals infinite free refills of their spacesuit thrusters without draining the fuel needed for ship thrusters. Which, by the way, you don't unlock until way up the tech tree. I landed on Mun and Minmus with no RCS at all, nor docking ports. My moon landing craft had all the fuel required for full return home, complete with heat shield for re-entry. I've still never actually hard docked one ship to another. One of the side effects of this is, if you really screw up, you can cheat by actually getting out and pushing your ship home. Yes. Seriously. Get out and push. It's only a tiny thrust, but it's a tiny, no fuel expended thrust. If you're very careful and if you have a ship design with something that will hold your Buck Rogers Kerbal in place, you can make up to about 2 meters per second difference in your orbital velocity per spacewalk. However, the ship will only maintain its attitude stay pointed in whatever direction it was when you got out if you leave a pilot inside or if you have a space probe core doing your flying. Otherwise the SAS system will automatically disengage, and any push that isn't dead perfectly centered will cause the ship to roll or tumble on some axis or other. So, you can push, but it's long, difficult, and incredibly boring. Yes, I've done it. And one time when I sent the Kerbal out to push some more, the game glitched, sending Kerbal and ship screaming apart from one another for no apparent reason. I was able to recover and fly the Kerbal back to the ship, but it certainly gave me a scare. Think of it as what might happen if you go on a spacewalk without depressurizing the cabin first. The Kerbals on missions never, ever, never take their helmets off, never mind the rest of their suits. This is not workable for storytelling purposes. Bathroom functions have been a top priority for NASA and other real-life spaceflight programs ever since it took flight controllers an hour to decide that Alan Shepard might as well go in his mercury pressure suit. Since then every astronaut, believe it or not, wears super high-tech diapers on launch and during spacewalks. Most notoriously, one astronaut wore her special safety pants to drive from Houston to Florida so she could confront her cheating husband. That was the end of her career, her husband's, and the other woman's. But that's nothing to do with this story. To the best of my knowledge, no space program has ever attempted a spacewalk without a second crewman remaining in the ship. On the ISS, spacewalkers routinely use clips and tethers to hold themselves in place, releasing them when they need to move from one place to another. MMUs were tested during the shuttle program, but it's much safer to have something holding you to the machine that's going to get you home alive. Anyone who's watched the climactic sequence of The Martian can see the logic in this. Finally, on the story, Rainbow Dash was shaken up a lot more than she's admitting to herself, but she's dead right about Twilight having it worse. Twilight feels responsible for all her friends, and in her mind she very nearly got one killed. They're working through it together, but that's going to leave lingering effects. Which the next full chapter, which will cover 2 or 3 missions depending on how dedicated the changelings are to testing out the new spacesuits and scientific gear. Oh, and flags. Definitely flags. And somewhere in that hobble Jimenez and 2 snooty unicorns get more space than they expected. End author's note.